Hello and welcome to the Global Hearth. I'm your host, Emma Rose Lynn, and we're here today in studio with Christopher Chavez. Chris Chávez is the Carolyn Silva Chambers Distinguished Professor of Advertising at the University of Oregon and the Director of the Center for Latina, Latino, Latin American Studies. His work explores how media, advertising, and global cultural industries shape ideas of identity, language, and belonging. In his latest book, Isle of Rum, Havana Club, Cultural Mediation, and the Fight for Cuban Authenticity, he unpacks how ideas of cultural authenticity are shaped, contested, and marketed across borders and industries. Beyond his writing, Professor Chavez has taken his work into the classroom and around the world by leading study abroad programs in Chile and Uruguay, where students collaborate with local organizations to see firsthand how media and cultural narratives play out in international contexts. Chris, we're so grateful to have you in studio today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really, really delighted to have this conversation, especially right now, kind of in the context of the American political moment that we're in. And I'm really curious, as a professor of advertising and also as a journalist, how do you define voice? And I wonder if you can describe from your perspective how the different manifestations of voicelessness occur in the media.
Thank you. I mostly draw from a sociolinguistic perspective, and so I'm looking at it from a couple of different ways. One is sonically, so looking at voice in its literal sense, prosody, accent, the particular language that you use. All of these things mark us. They tell us where we come from, our backgrounds, our class positions, subject identities of all kinds, but yet we place value judgments on these different ways of speaking. So everybody gets judged differently according to the way that they speak. And then I'm interested in voice in the collective sense, like who gets to have a voice, which communities get to be heard, which other communities are rendered voiceless in this process. If you look at the power of the administration, they have access to voices of all kinds, right? So they have a mechanism in which to articulate their positions in their own voices, in the dominant language, English. But then you have so many communities that are impacted by these same policies that don't have access to these same sort of mediums.
So it's not only how you sound, where you can kind of identify someone or make a guess where someone comes from regionally or nationally, but it's also who actually gets heard. You spoke to this a little bit, but how does that show up or manifest in relationship to power? Right. So certain people are making the decisions about who gets on the mic or who gets an editorial voice.
Right.
Can you describe how that plays out in the context of oppression or marginalization?
Yeah, I play it out in two different ways. So the book that I wrote, which is on NPR, it's America's public radio station, right? So it's a flagship network that purports to represent the public. At the same time, they made very clear editorial decisions that this will be basically an English monolingual station. And already there, you're already favoring one kind of speaker and excluding another kind of speaker. Some of these things happen implicitly. So the way that we train our journalism students here, for example, we train them to speak in a particular way and perform in a particular way that is almost devoid of accent, but privileges a certain way of speaking. And then there are kind of explicit forms of coercion. So if you were to go on to NPR, they would have very specific editorial practices that would say, okay, perform this way, modulate your voice this way. And so there are certain kinds of coercion effects that are going on there. The other example that I would give that comes closer to home is, a couple of years ago, there was a protest. Students were disrupting President Chill at the time address that he was giving. And so they were conscious about cost tuition rising, some of the investments that the university was making. And so they felt compelled to interrupt his speech. Anyways, as the president of a university, a very powerful position, he had access to the New York Times and was able to write an op-ed piece, again, in his own voice, articulating his position and really drowning out the concerns, in some ways minimizing the concerns that the students had at that time. So he had access to this very, very powerful apparatus that the students wouldn't have had access to.
I see. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious on a personal historical note.
Sure.
Your career began in advertising and media, and you worked as an advertising executive in various professional firms. And then you made the transition into academia. First, you worked at St. Louis University, and then we were lucky enough to get you here at the University of Oregon. And much of your research now focuses on the way that Latino and Latina voices are represented or silenced in the public media. Was there a moment that was kind of a turning point where you realized that academia or academic research would be a more effective place for you to do the kind of work that you wanted to do in the world. What caused you to make that shift from the private sector into the public research
Right.
and teaching sector?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So, and I had written about this. So when I was in advertising, I used to work at a very creative agency in San Francisco called Goodby Silverstein and Partners. And I worked for some time. And they're a great creative shop, really known for fantastic work. But the advertising industry, like many culture industries, are primarily white public spaces. So there's not a lot of Latinos that work there. So every time that the agency would want to get into Hispanic marketing, I would often be invited to these meetings to serve as sort of a de facto consultant on some of these issues. But I remember one particular moment in which we were presenting a radio script. You generally have the copywriter presenting the script in their voice, and then I was there as the account person, and then we have a creative director and a client. Well, the client and the creative director couldn't speak Spanish, and the script was written in Spanish. And so you had this performance where the copywriter was presenting the work, and then you had a befuddled client and a creative director who didn't understand it, right? And it was one of those things where it dawned on me like, wow, this is why there's so much bad advertising when it comes to Latino consumers, because the system sort of breaks down. So that became the issue that I wanted to study when I did my dissertation. So that was the focal point of the dissertation, which is how the advertising industry conceptualizes Latinos and what are the practices and logics of practice that they use to reach out to them. I think the difference for me is when you're in advertising, you're doing, right? You're creating. So much of your time is spent making advertising, and it moves very, very quickly, right? The speed in which culture production happens in the industries happens very, very quickly and efficiently. And you don't have the same time for reflection. In academia, it's almost the opposite, right? You're not really beholden to timelines in the same way. You have more time to think about something and put it into a historical context. So I would say the big distinction is that in my professional world, I was making and creating. And then in the academic world, I was able to now reflect on some of those practices. And I think having that experience, makes me a better critical scholar, just because I know the mechanisms by which this works, right? I know the mechanisms by which advertising is created, who are the players involved in it. And I think that allows me to see power dynamics, for example, that I didn't see before.
Can you tell me more about bad advertising for the Latin American community?
So there's a lot of kind of common tropes, right, that happen. So one would be the abuelita. So the assumption that Latinos are very family-oriented and see a lot of grandmothers in advertisements. Latinos love football, soccer. So you see a lot of soccer balls in advertising, and they're just sort of thrown in there gratuitously. And then just there's something that everybody is just sort of one group, right? So all the logics that you would apply to other groups, like that a Southerner sounds differently than somebody from New York, which sounds differently from California. And all of those assumptions, for whatever, get forgotten, when it comes to Latino consumers. And so there's a flattening out.
Right. When you don't have people in the room who are representing the community that you're trying to speak to, you're going to end up kind of playing to some tropes or stereotypes. And that's going to be like really distinctly felt by the person on the receiving end. So tell me a little bit about language ideology. This is something that you wrote about in Reinventing the Latino Television Viewer. Can you explain what language ideology is?
So language ideology is generally referring to the political and moral implications involved with language usage. And there are typically three processes that I would write about. So one would be iconization. So that's the assumption that people are associated with the language that they speak. So in this case, the assumption is that Latinos are a Spanish-speaking people, despite some of the linguistic nuances that may happen, right? There are levels of proficiency in Spanish and English. There's also regional distinctions of all kinds, but a flattening out, right? So the assumption that Latinos speak Spanish, and that will drive certain decisions. Then there's fractal recursivity, which is understanding that language exists within a hierarchy. So some ways of speaking are privileged more than others. And so, for example, if you see within the advertising realm or even within any kind of entertainment, British received pronunciation is kind of an elevated form of speaking and associated with prestige. Puerto Rican accents, Southern accents, marginalized varieties of all kinds are seen as sort of lesser speakers, right? And so they tend to be denigrated in the media. But there is a clear linguistic hierarchy. And so placing kind of different languages in privileged positions versus others. And then finally is erasure, right? The way of getting rid of a language altogether. And we see this happening, and they argue that the United States is particularly aggressively English monolingual, which means we promote English at the expense of all others. I almost see it as a zero-sum game, and so minimalizing other ways of speaking in public spaces.
I could see how that would create a lot of cognitive dissonance. And I would imagine that most of us can relate to this, where your microculture of your town or your city that you grew up in, you know that through lived experience. And when you see someone come in who doesn't know that place and then they make assumptions or they tell a story about it without asking enough questions and assuming some details, and when that's happening, your entire way of speaking and your entire way of expressing yourself is being then erased. It's an emotional piece of this, which in a lot of ways in academia, I don't know that we necessarily center the emotional experience in the same way.
Absolutely. And you notice some of the contradictions, even in the way that we teach here at the School of Journalism and Communication, for example. If you imagine that the world is messy in a beautiful kind of way, there's all kinds of ranges of ways of speaking and ways of being, but we kind of course towards one way of speaking. And so when we teach journalism, for example, you have to take classes on the right way to write a piece, the right way to perform it, right? And that is a coercive technique. When we teach advertising, which is where most of my teaching function is filled, it's almost always English and American. We very rarely get to hear advertisements in other languages.
What would be the converse to that if approaching it from this is the right way to do it is considered coercive? And I wonder if you could explore that a little bit for us. How is that coercive? And then what might an alternative approach be?
Yeah, and this is where I struggle with it as an instructor, right? Because on one hand, as an academic, you want the world and you want culture and the media industries to reflect that messiness, that beautiful messiness and the range of speaking. At the same time, I'm very aware that these culture industries are governed by rules and conventions and norms. And if students want to find an entryway into these rules, they have to master the conventions of that norm, right? And so they have to learn to write in the correct way and perform in the correct way. And so there's the world as I would want it to be, and then the world as it is. And then how do I prepare students to negotiate that? I guess my hope is that they become more aware of sort of a form of consciousness raising, so that when they're in more privileged positions and then they're serving the roles as editors or producers, that they're at least more open to different ways of speaking, more open to different possibilities for language.
Sounds like you're teaching critical thinking.
I hope so.
I don't know about that. I'm relating to this also because I'm going to out myself a little bit here. I've said on the podcast before that I'm a musician. I'm a vocalist and I'm a voice teacher. And so I'm fascinated by the voice. And I love to sing and I love helping people sing. And I love diction and the weird small ways that you have to place your tongue in order to pronounce different languages, things like that. That gets me really excited. And I wonder when there is an established code of conduct or communication, but it's unconsciously reinforcing oppressive dynamics or coercive dynamics. Are there functional ways to disrupt that or to effectively shift a certain conversation? Like if you're in a room and you're a student of journalism, for example, you know a certain story and you see that it's not being represented. Do you have any advice for young people on how to advocate for their perspective getting heard in a way that's going to be effective, but then ultimately actually does create change in the dynamic? I wonder if you could speak to that or even an experience that you've had.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I kind of look at the tension between agency and structure, right? So structurally, you have these issues, like the system is what it is, and there are kind of ways to make it. But again, to navigate these systems, you have to know it, to understand it. And then there's agency, right? The role of an individual to assert their point of view. And there are cases where people, again, learn to navigate the system for their own purposes, right? They have to be very political about it, but kind of making arguments as to why a particular creative decision or a linguistic decision is important, how it might help the piece, how it might help the piece reach a new audience. But I think they have to understand kind of how the system works before they can kind of advocate for themselves, because oftentimes they'll hit a wall.
Yeah. So your work also looks at how global media organizes and reorganizes collective identity. How do you see that playing out in today's streaming and social media landscape? Can you give us an example? Like, what are some of the ways that people are organized and reorganized?
Yeah, so I think about it in terms of like there are ways of constructing our identities in all kinds of ways. And I'll look at kind of geographical location. So for many years, identity was based on fixed facial concepts, like where you were born, the town you were raised in, and even like Mexico, which is the area that my family comes from. Our family comes from Puerto, a small town in Michoacan. And their culture is very distinct. They're distinct rebosos, ways of like scarves, music, and it's all very, very local. And then you have the nation state, right? Mexican, which is taking all of these different regions and then constructing it into a national identity. And then those in some ways are fabricated projects. Then you have kind of a pan-ethnic identity, Latino, right? For example, which is kind of minimizing differences between nation states or even regions within those nation states and creating this large pan-ethnic construct. And we're all navigating these, right? And so my father-in-law, for example, comes from Jalisco. I suspect he thinks of himself largely in terms of being Jalisco, like from that particular region. And probably when he crossed the border, he started to imagine himself as being Mexican, right? Because then all of those groups are collected together as Mexican or Mexican-American, Chicano. I think of myself probably interchangeably, but where the streaming platforms come into this is that I can create solidarity, with other nations. So in my playlist, for example, I'll listen to a Mexican band, Café Tacuba, but also Juana Molina from Argentina, Bad Bunny from Puerto Rico. And so you're listening to these spaces of solidarity. And so I would say like media can create both spaces of solidarity and like that, but also spaces of erasure, right? Because you're assuming that there is a thing called Latino that exists in the real world, when in fact it's likely a construction, right? Meant to serve particular kinds of purposes.
I think what I hear that you describing, though, is ways that people can practice agency, even if we understand how these systems work and where some of the freeze is, that we can practice agency in creating little spaces of warmth, even within that.
Yeah.
Even if there's a fiction or some storytelling or some collective identity creation that's happening, that it's also happening in conversation with some of those powers that be.
Yeah, and I think there's real potential for that. Economic solidarity, political solidarity. And so if you're, just looking at Mexican Americans in Southern California, like that's a formidable group. But if you combine that with Puerto Ricans living in New York or Mexican Americans living in Chicago, all of a sudden you have a block, and that block could have some power, right? In theory.
When you look at current debates around media diversity, what progress do you see?
Yeah, I feel like it's a mixed bag. I think when you look at cinema today, you are going to see more diversity in some ways. In some ways, there's a colorblind approach. So you'll see more ethnic, racial diversity reflected, but almost without regard to the historical context of race and ethnicity, right? So Bridgerton would be a pretty good example, right? The inclusion of people of color in Victorian England without acknowledging slavery or acknowledging some of the oppression that happened with particular groups. And so in some ways, there's this colorblind approach that in some ways obscures the realities of it. And then at the same time, as somebody that studies specifically Latino communities, just the continued absence of Latinos in film and television, right? In those industries in particular. And this has always surprised me because the Hollywood system is based in Southern California. LA is 48% Latino. So that's an obvious distinction between the reality as it exists, literally in the backyard of Hollywood and Hollywood, right? In which we still are underrepresented.
From your perspective as a journalist, but also as a professor of advertising, how do you guide listeners, consumers, viewers to identify quality information? Like if these blind spots kind of exist, if you're white, middle class, and you've grown up thinking that it's pretty normal to only see white people in TV, how would you guide someone to start questioning that bias?
Right. It's a hard task. I guess I start by encouraging them to be critical consumers of media. So whatever you're reading, even if it's the New York Times, which is, quote, supposedly one of the most established newspapers, right? It still has some biases in it, right? And so to be very critical of what they're reading and to always look at it further. And then to diversify their diet, really to triangulate information by reading different kinds of things. So maybe it's the New York Times in addition to, like for me, Los Angeles Times, but also Al Jazeera, which is more of an international perspective. And so trying to diversify your diet. That's a heavy ask for students who are already busy and going to have their own consumption media patterns. So I think that's a tough one, but that's the hope.
Do you have a sense of how to help people identify misinformation? And also, I'm thinking about that video used to be kind of the gold standard. And now with AI videos and video manipulation, it's not anymore necessarily, which is kind of mind-blowing.
Right.
How do you approach that? What do you listen to both internally and externally to kind of help discern that?
Yeah, what a tricky moment that we're living in right now, because all this is happening real time. And I think there's the assumption that consumers of media are easily duped. And I suspect there are some, but ideally with media literacy courses, you learn to just be a healthy skeptic of anything that you're looking at And I wonder if today, when we do see a video, if that's the natural inclination, is like what I'm seeing is true, or if people coming at it automatically with a healthy dose of suspicion. I don't know. Like I think we need more research in terms of how consumers are making sense of these videos, because I think it's happening right away, and I'm not sure if people are believing what they're seeing anymore. Which is a difficult time to live in.
Definitely. Yeah. You've mentioned already that you've used NPR as a case study, National Public Radio, and you identify how Latinx are marginalized within the context of journalism. And some of the argument that you're making is critical of the way that diversity within Spanish-speaking communities becomes homogenized, like you were speaking to earlier, especially when there's so little airspace to begin with. And I'm curious how that phenomenon intersects with your understanding of like critical theory. If Spanish itself is a colonial language and there's indigenous culture that's kind of mixed into that, how do the dynamics of colonialism play into your work?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's kind of interesting. So Renato Ortiz is a Brazilian scholar, and he talks about sort of this notion of Latin America is what he's talking about. Like, can you even say there's such a thing called Latin America when the colonial experiences are so different? And so when you're looking at kind of the experience in Peru, which is primarily Amazonian, versus the project in Chile versus the project in Mexico, they're so different. Not only kind of did the colonial experience get enacted differently there, but the people, the indigenous peoples were so different, right? The Aztecs and the Nahual versus other populations. And so there's so much diversity in there. At the same time, they are kind of shared experiences. And so when I think of a conflicted relationship to Spanish, it's a colonial language that involved the erasure of all kinds of